Before a famous toothpaste campaign, only 7% of Americans brushed their teeth. Within a decade, that jumped to 65%, not because the product worked better, but because someone engineered a craving. Welcome to Whispering Pages. If you're here just for the summary, skip to the next chapter. For the rest of us, let's ease in. Let the sound settle, the hum of the room, the weight of the body. Nothing needs you tonight. The brain before sleep is receptive. What you hear now consolidates while you rest. Tonight, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, 2012, a book showing how the hidden loops driving our behavior can be understood and changed. So let's begin. Close your eyes if you'd like. And let's whisper through this one together. Charles Duhigg spent years as a reporter for the New York Times before writing The Power of Habit, and his journalism background shows on every page. He doesn't just explain ideas, he tells stories. Stories about forgotten men in laboratory hallways, about aluminium plants and NFL coaches, and a woman who transformed her entire life after a breakdown in Cairo. And somewhere in all those stories, the same architecture keeps appearing: a cue, a routine, a reward. 3 steps, 1 loop. And everything we do, good and bad, intentional or not, gets built inside it. The book was published in 2012, at a moment when the science of habit had quietly exploded. Researchers at MIT, Harvard, Duke, and dozens of other institutions had spent 2 decades mapping how the brain constructs automatic behavior. They had found the structures, traced the chemicals, watched it happen in real time inside the skulls of monkeys and rats and amnesiac men in California. Duhigg became the writer who translated all of that research into something you could actually use. His central argument is deceptively simple: habits are not personality traits. They're not who you are. They're patterns your brain has built to conserve energy. And because they are patterns, they can be changed, if you understand how they were assembled in the first place. To explain this, Duhigg begins with a man called Eugene. In the early 1990s, a viral infection carved through Eugene's brain with what one researcher described as surgical precision. By the time the fever broke, large portions of his memory were gone. He couldn't remember where his bedroom was. Couldn't recognize his own children when they came to visit. Couldn't recall why he was in the hospital, or that he'd ever been ill. Each morning was entirely new. And yet, every morning, he walked out his front door, circled the same neighborhood streets, and found his way home. Every day, he opened the kitchen cabinet and retrieved the exact snack he'd always eaten. He performed the routines of his life without any conscious memory of having learned them. Scientists at the University of California studied Eugene for years, and what they discovered changed neuroscience. The part of his brain responsible for forming new memories had been destroyed. But deep inside his skull, an ancient region called the basal ganglia was entirely intact. And it turned out that the basal ganglia is where habits live. It stores our automatic patterns, separate from conscious memory, separate from deliberate reasoning, running quietly in the background while the rest of the brain rests or wanders. To see how this works, Duhigg turns to experiments conducted at MIT in the 1990s. Researchers implanted tiny sensors in the skulls of rats and observed their brain activity as the animals were trained to navigate a T-shaped maze with chocolate at one end. The first time a rat ran the maze, its brain lit up entirely. Every smell was processed. Every corner analyzed. Every wrong turn evaluated. The rat was working hard. But something remarkable happened over the following days. As the maze became familiar, brain activity began to collapse. The sniffing stopped. The hesitations disappeared. The rat ran faster and faster, and its brain grew quieter and quieter. By the time the route was fully memorized, the brain had gone almost completely still. The basal ganglia was handling everything. What had once required conscious effort had been compressed into a single automated package. The researchers called this process chunking. The brain takes a sequence of actions, bundles them together, and runs them without deliberate thought. That's what a habit is. A chunk. A compressed shortcut. A way of outsourcing effort to a part of the brain that never tires. And the efficiency of this system is breathtaking. Think about driving a familiar route. In the early days of learning, operating a car demanded your entire attention. Mirror checks, gear shifts, the width between your bumper and the curb. Now you arrive at your destination and barely remember the journey. The basal ganglia drove. Your conscious mind was elsewhere. And once formed, Duhigg argues, a habit never truly disappears. It waits. Wired into your neural circuitry, encoded in structures that don't forget, ready to re-emerge the moment the right cue appears. That's why a single bite of a once craved food can feel like no time has passed. The habit was never gone. It was only dormant. This is both the gift and the trap of habit. The same mechanism that lets you brush your teeth on autopilot while thinking about tomorrow's meeting also keeps you reaching for your phone the moment boredom arrives. Understanding the loop is the first step to choosing which of those futures you'd rather build. And that is exactly what the rest of this book sets out to help you do, starting with the one ingredient the loop cannot run without. The habit loop has three distinct components, and Duhigg gives each one the attention it deserves. The cue is the trigger, the signal that tells your brain a familiar pattern is ready to run. The routine is the behavior itself, which can be physical, mental, or emotional. And the reward is what the brain receives at the end, the signal that tells it whether this loop is worth keeping. Simple enough on paper. But what makes this more than just a model is the fourth element Duhigg says nearly everyone misses: craving. Craving is what transforms a loop into a compulsion. It's what gives the cue its power and makes the reward feel necessary rather than optional. And to explain how cravings form, Duhigg visits a neuroscience laboratory at Cambridge where a researcher spent years studying the brains of monkeys. A macaque named Julio was trained to touch a lever whenever shapes appeared on a screen. Each correct response delivered a drop of blackberry juice. At first, Julio's brain activity spiked only when the juice arrived, a pleasure response that confirmed, reward received. But over weeks of repetition, something shifted. The brain activity began appearing earlier and earlier. By the time the habit was fully formed, Julio's brain was lighting up the moment the shapes appeared on the screen, before any lever was touched, before any juice was delivered. The anticipation had become the reward. And when Julio saw the cue and the juice failed to arrive, perhaps it was delayed, or diluted, or withheld entirely, he didn't simply feel neutral. He grew frustrated. His behavior became erratic. He had developed a craving, and that craving had a grip on him that the original reward alone never had. This, Duhigg argues, is the real engine of habit. Cravings don't feel like habits. They feel like genuine needs. When a smoker sees a cigarette, their brain is already anticipating the nicotine before the first breath. When a phone screen lights up, the hand is reaching before a decision has been made. The craving has learned the cue, and it runs ahead of conscious choice. This explains one of the book's most interesting business stories, the near collapse and dramatic rescue of Febreze. Procter & Gamble's chemists had developed a spray that genuinely eliminated bad odors, not masked them, actually dissolved the molecules causing the smell. They were convinced they had a hit. They filmed television commercials featuring people tormented by cigarette smells and pet odors. They positioned Febreze as a solution to an embarrassing problem. Sales were catastrophic. When researchers went into people's homes to understand why, they found something unexpected. The people with the smelliest homes, homes with 9 cats, or pervasive skunk spray, or decades of cigarette smoke, couldn't smell anything wrong. Prolonged exposure had desensitized their noses entirely. The cue Febreze was designed to trigger didn't exist for the very people who needed it most. And without a cue, there was no craving. Without a craving, there was no habit. The breakthrough came when researchers visited a woman in a suburb of Phoenix who loved Febreze. Her home had no particular odor problem. She used it as a finishing touch, a small ritual at the end of cleaning a room. Making a bed, smoothing the duvet, then a light spray. Something about that sequence felt satisfying. Complete. The product wasn't solving a problem. It was providing a reward. A sensory signal that the job was done. Researchers reviewed hours of video footage of people cleaning and noticed something they'd overlooked. A small, quiet smile at the end of each task. The moment of satisfaction when a room is finally tidy. Procter & Gamble reformulated the campaign entirely. They added more fragrance to the product, redesigned the packaging with images of open windows and fresh air, and repositioned Febreze not as a problem solver but as a reward. The tagline shifted from "Gets bad smells out of fabrics" to "Cleans life smells." They built a craving, the desire for everything to smell as clean as it looked. Sales doubled within 2 months. Within a year, Febreze was generating over $200 million annually. The product hadn't changed. The habit loop had been rebuilt around a craving that actually existed. The toothpaste story follows a similar logic, and it's one Duhigg traces with particular care. Before the early 20th century, almost nobody in America brushed their teeth regularly. An advertising man named Claude Hopkins changed this, not by educating people about dental health, but by identifying a cue people could feel with their own tongue. The invisible film that coats your teeth throughout the day. He named it. He made people conscious of it. And then he offered a reward, a beautiful, confident smile. But what actually made Pepsodent work, what Hopkins didn't even realize he'd done, was that the toothpaste contained compounds that created a cool, tingling sensation in the mouth. People grew to crave that tingle. They associated it with cleanliness. When they skipped brushing, they noticed its absence. A craving had formed, and that craving, not health consciousness, not vanity, is what built a global daily habit inside a single generation. If you want to break a habit, Duhigg says, you can't simply cut it out. The brain doesn't work that way. Once a habit is wired into the basal ganglia, removing the routine leaves a void, and a void with a cue and a reward attached to it is a void that will be filled, one way or another. The principle Duhigg calls the golden rule of habit change is this: keep the same cue, keep the same reward, but insert a new routine. It sounds almost too neat to be true, but the evidence behind it spans football fields, rehab centers, and decades of clinical research. Tony Dungy understood this before anyone had put it into a scientific framework. When he took over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 1996, he inherited one of the most dysfunctional teams in the NFL. They hadn't had a winning season in years. And Dungy's coaching philosophy was immediately counterintuitive. He didn't want his players to think. He argued, patiently, to anyone who would listen, that thinking was what slowed you down. In a sport where outcomes are decided in fractions of a second, the player who hesitates loses. What he wanted was for his players to react, to move before their conscious minds could intervene and second guess. To achieve this, he didn't introduce hundreds of new plays. He introduced a handful, and drilled them until they ran automatically. He identified the visual cues his players were already trained to notice: the stance of an opponent's foot, the rotation of a lineman's shoulders, the spacing in a formation, and he mapped specific, practiced responses to each of those cues. The players didn't have to decide what to do when they saw the signal. They had already decided, weeks and months earlier, in practice. By game day, the decision was gone. The habit ran instead. In the first season, the Buccaneers struggled. The system required players to genuinely trust it, and trust took time. But the patterns began to take hold. Within 2 years, the team reached the playoffs for the first time in 15 years. Within a decade, Dungy became the only coach in NFL history to reach the playoffs in 10 consecutive years. His teams won not by being more talented, but by being faster, and they were faster because their habits removed the gap between signal and action. What Duhigg finds most compelling, though, is that Dungy's insight had already been in practice for decades inside an organization that had nothing to do with sport. Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in the 1930s, had quietly built one of the most effective habit change systems ever designed, without any knowledge of the neuroscience that would eventually explain why it worked. AA doesn't try to eliminate the craving for alcohol. It doesn't claim to fix the brain's reward circuitry or address the biochemical underpinnings of addiction. What it does is map the cues, and for most alcoholics, those cues are emotional: anxiety, loneliness, the weight of a hard day, the sudden need to feel like someone else for a while, and then it builds new routines that deliver the same rewards the drink once provided. The meeting hall offers companionship. The sponsor relationship offers attention and release. The ritual of standing up and telling your story offers the same relief that alcohol once delivered. The feeling of being seen, of existing somewhere outside your own head. The loop runs. It just runs through a different channel. But Duhigg goes one step further, and this is where the book gets particularly thoughtful. The golden rule alone isn't sufficient. Researchers studying long-term sobriety found a pattern. People could identify their cues, practice their new routines, attend meetings diligently, and still collapse when life hit hard enough. What separated those who stayed sober was something harder to measure and harder to manufacture: belief. A genuine conviction that change was possible. That the new version of the loop could hold when everything else was falling apart. And what the data showed was that this belief didn't tend to emerge from private determination. It emerged from community. From being in a room full of people who had already changed, and watching it happen. From seeing, in someone else's eyes, that the person you want to become is real and reachable. AA's insistence on meetings, Duhigg argues, isn't incidental. It's structural. It puts people inside a space where belief is visible and contagious. Dungy's Colts eventually reached the Super Bowl in 2007, after years of falling apart under pressure. Players described the shift in terms of belonging, a bond that formed in the aftermath of Dungy's personal tragedy, when his son passed away and the team rallied around him. The habits were already there. What finally locked them in was the belief that they were playing for something, and for each other. Not just repetition, but meaning. And that combination, repeated routine, reinforced by belief, is what the research says makes a changed habit actually stick. The second section of the book shifts scale, and the shift is dramatic. Duhigg moves from individual habits to the habits of organizations, the routines that shape how companies work, how teams collaborate, and how institutions either thrive or catastrophically fail. And the lessons here are at least as important as anything in the personal development sections. In 1987, a man named Paul O'Neill became CEO of Alcoa, one of the largest aluminium manufacturers in the world. He was a former government bureaucrat, largely unknown to Wall Street, and the investors who gathered to hear his first address had very specific expectations. Talk about profit margins, address the competition, outline a restructuring plan. O'Neill did none of that. He stood up and said that his single priority as chief executive would be worker safety. Not improved safety. Zero injuries. Not at some point in the future. Starting now. The room was baffled. Some were alarmed. One investor phoned 20 of his largest clients from the lobby payphone immediately after the speech and told them to sell every share they held in Alcoa. He later described that call as the worst financial advice of his entire career. Within a year, Alcoa's profits had broken records. By the time O'Neill retired in 2000, net income was 5 times larger than when he had arrived. The market value of the company had grown by $27 billion, and the worker injury rate had fallen to 1/20th of the American industrial average. The company had been transformed, not by a new product, not by a restructuring, but by the relentless focus on one keystone habit. Duhigg uses the word keystone deliberately. A keystone is the central stone in an arch. Remove it, and the whole structure collapses. Keystone habits work the same way, except in reverse. Install one, and other structures begin to organize themselves around it. When O'Neill mandated zero injuries, he created a chain of necessity. To have zero injuries, you needed real-time communication between workers and executives. To have that communication, you needed workers who felt safe speaking up. To have workers who felt safe, you needed managers who listened. To have managers who listened, you needed a culture that rewarded honesty over hierarchy. And so it went, one requirement generating another, until the entire organization had been restructured without O'Neill ever managing most of the details. He changed one habit, and watched the rest of the company follow. Duhigg documents the same dynamic across very different contexts. Researchers studying exercise found that people who begin working out regularly, even once a week, tend to eat better, sleep more, manage money more carefully, and feel more productive at work. Not because exercise directly causes those things, but because a small win, the feeling of having done something difficult and worthwhile, creates momentum that spills into other areas. The self-discipline muscle, having been exercised in one domain, seems to operate more readily in others. Michael Phelps is the individual scale embodiment of this. His longtime coach Bob Bowman built his training regime around habits that had nothing directly to do with swimming. The most important was visualization. Each night before sleep and each morning on waking, Phelps would mentally rehearse the perfect race in granular detail. The entry into the water, the pull of each stroke, the turn off the wall, the final push. He would see the entire competition, eyes closed, frame by frame, until it was as familiar as memory. Bowman called it watching the tape, and on race day, all he had to do was whisper those words, and Phelps would settle into the automatic state of someone who has already won. At the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, Phelps's goggles filled with water during the 200-meter butterfly. By the final lap he was completely blind, couldn't see the line, couldn't see the approaching wall. He had rehearsed this scenario. He had counted his strokes in his mental tape 100 times. He reached 21 strokes, stretched his arm, and touched the wall. He had timed it perfectly, and broken the world record without being able to see anything. The organization chapter ends on a darker note. Rhode Island Hospital, one of the most respected medical institutions in the country, was also governed by habits, but its habits had grown from conflict rather than care. Nurses had developed informal warning systems to navigate the ward's culture. Whiteboard colors signaled which surgeons could be safely challenged on a safety concern and which would erupt. Unofficial rules told staff to absorb abuse rather than escalate. These were the habits that filled the gap left by inadequate official policy. And in 2007, a surgeon operated on the wrong side of an elderly patient's skull. The patient died 2 weeks later. The habits built around protecting staff from difficult doctors had, over time, eliminated the checks that might have caught the error before it was made. When organizations don't deliberately design their habits, Duhigg argues, habits form anyway, often around fear, around avoidance, around the path of least resistance. And those habits have consequences. The final section of The Power of Habit zooms out to the habits of societies. Duhigg asks whether the same loop, cue, routine, reward, can be found inside social movements, cultural shifts, and the quiet engineering of consumer behavior across millions of people. His answer, carefully documented, is yes. He examines Starbucks, and the story is more interesting than it might sound. Howard Schultz built the company into a global brand by making every interaction feel like a small act of care. Baristas were trained not just to make drinks but to deliver what he called a moment of connection. The problem was that this required emotional labor, and emotional labor under pressure, at the end of a long shift, with a queue stretching out the door, is exhausting. Starbucks discovered that willpower functions like a muscle. It tires. A worker who starts the day calm and attentive becomes more brittle as the shift wears on. The company's solution was to build habit loops for the moments of greatest pressure. They developed a system called the latte method. Listen, acknowledge the complaint, take action to solve the problem, thank the customer, and explain why the issue occurred. Workers drilled it until it became automatic. When a difficult customer appeared, the trained response ran, not a decision, not an improvisation, but a practiced routine. The stress still arrived. The habit absorbed it. This willpower research connects to broader findings Duhigg surveys. Studies from the 1990s showed that willpower is depleted by use. Participants who resisted a bowl of freshly baked cookies subsequently gave up on a frustrating puzzle much faster than those who hadn't been asked to resist anything. Their willpower had been spent. And yet researchers also found that willpower strengthens with practice. People who enrolled in exercise programs became not just fitter, but also more disciplined in their diets, their finances, and their work habits. The capacity for self-regulation, once exercised, seemed to generalize. Duhigg then turns to something more uncomfortable, the social scale at which habits operate. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded in part because the black community of Montgomery had already built something remarkable, a dense web of social connection, mutual obligation, and shared routine. When Rosa Parks was arrested in December of 1955, word spread not through any organized campaign but through the texture of community life. She was known, trusted, embedded in networks of friendship and church and work that extended across the city. The habit of showing up for one another, of acting when someone in the network needed support, already existed. The movement didn't create that habit. It channeled it. At the corporate end of the scale, Duhigg examines how Target's data scientists built algorithms capable of predicting customer pregnancies before any public announcement had been made. By identifying shifts in purchasing patterns, the sudden appearance of unscented lotion, calcium supplements, cotton balls, they could calculate a likely due date with uncomfortable accuracy. When customers began noticing that coupons for baby products were appearing in their catalogs seemingly by coincidence, some became unsettled. Target's response was quietly brilliant. They mixed the pregnancy-targeted offers into catalogs filled with completely unrelated items, so the targeting felt accidental. The engineering of habit, the book suggests, works most smoothly when it doesn't announce itself. This raises the book's final question. If so much of our behavior runs on automatic, shaped by cues we didn't choose and rewards we didn't consciously select, how much responsibility do we carry for what we do? Duhigg's answer is careful. He argues that ignorance of a habit provides a kind of excuse. But once you can see the loop, once you know the cue and the routine and the reward, you carry an obligation to examine it. Not necessarily to change it, but to know it. To have chosen it, at least once, deliberately. Where the book is most honest is also where it's most useful. Duhigg doesn't promise transformation. He offers a framework, and acknowledges that understanding how habits work doesn't automatically make them easier to change. Knowing the loop is not the same as changing it. Community, repetition, belief, those remain the real mechanisms. Understanding is just the door. If you want to go deeper on the practical side, James Clear's Atomic Habits builds a daily system on top of everything Duhigg maps here. Concrete strategies for stacking cues, designing rewards, and making new routines easier to start. It fills the gap this book deliberately leaves open. And for the organizational thread, our Thinking Fast and Slow episode covers the cognitive shortcuts that shape how institutions decide, a natural companion to what you heard tonight. If there's one idea to carry into sleep tonight, let it be this. Every automatic thing you do began as a deliberate choice, somewhere back in time. Which means every deliberate choice you make today is the beginning of something automatic. You are, right now, building tomorrow's habits. And that is an invitation. Sleep well. And we'll see you at Whispering Pages for the next one.